Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ron Halber, and I am the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. The JCRC serves as the public affairs and community relations arm of the organized Jewish community in our nation's capital. We represent more than 100 organizations and synagogues throughout the region, and a key component of our work is to empower, train, and mobilize the Jewish community and others to engage with and advocate for Israel. I'd like to begin by thanking the more than 250 people who registered from our region and throughout the United States and Israel and signed up for today's online seminar and are joining us on such short notice. I would also like to thank Adam Odesser, director of our Dr. Stuart Lessons Israel Action Center, for arranging this online seminar. Many of you may have just heard the news recently, just in the last few minutes, out of Israel. There's been a terrorist attack that has wounded 6 people, several seriously. This comes on tack of 3. This comes there have been 3 previous attacks that have claimed 11 Israeli lives in the last 2 weeks, and it goes without saying that we at the JCRC of Greater Washington, the Washington Jewish community, are disgusted and abhorred by these attacks, that we send our love and our sympathy to the people of Israel, our thoughts and prayers, and that we stand with them in solidarity. Yesterday, the Israeli government was put into crisis mode as its coalition chairperson, Edith Stillman, announced her resignation, stripping the coalition of its narrow majority. Those of us who are familiar with Israeli politics know that Israel's current coalition is fragile, consisting of political parties who typically do not agree on many issues. However, after 4 rounds of elections in Israel between 2019 and 2021, this coalition was formed to avoid a 5th round of elections. To discuss recent developments, and I know originally we were going to focus on the political developments, but Amir, please feel free to talk about, what's happening in Israel this afternoon or this evening, your time, and to connect it with political analysis. We're glad to have with us today a dear friend of ours. I got to know while he was a journalist here in Washington, Haaretz Journalist Amir Tibon. Amir is the U.S. news editor for Haaretz and was the Washington correspondent from Haaretz from 2017 to 2020. Prolific writer on Israel and the Middle East. His articles have appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, Foreign Affairs, and other leading U.S. publications. And Amir lives in Kibbutz Nahal Oz, the closest place in Israel to Gaza, with his wife and 2 children. Amir will give an overview of recent events, and then I'll follow up with some additional questions from our audience. If you have any questions at any point, please use the Q&A feature, as we hope to take as many questions as possible. I ask that they please be succinct so we can get in as many as possible. And I'd also like to note that this call is being recorded, and closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen. Amir, once again, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Hey, hi everyone. I wanted to open with a good evening. It's a bit difficult to say it in these circumstances. Not a very good evening, obviously, here in Israel. Tragic situation. We were planning to mostly discuss the political situation, and we will. But I have to update, first of all, like Ron said, a bit about what happened in Tel Aviv, and the details are still coming in. We know there was a shooting attack on Dizengoff Street Thursday evening, Dizengoff Street, Central Tel Aviv. This is a time when thousands of people are out having, having a good time and celebrating the upcoming weekend. And right
Amir,
now,
they just wanted to say two.
I know. We know right now to say that there were 2 people who were killed in this attack. And at least 10 who were injured in different levels of the severity. And we also know to say that the event is ongoing, meaning the police is not sure yet if it has already either killed or arrested or neutralized all of the people involved. There is a suspicion on the behalf of the police that there may be more than 1 terrorist involved here. That this was some kind of an attack involving multiple people. It's a very, very difficult evening, and like Ron said, it comes on top of an already difficult period. We've had 3 major terror attacks in the last 2 weeks, and with the 2 people who are now confirmed dead in Tel Aviv, we're talking about 13 people killed in these different attacks. The first one was in Be'er Sheva, in the south of Israel, 2 weeks ago. After that, in Hadera. Then a big event in Bnei Brak, near Tel Aviv, and now this event tonight in Dizengoff. And as we'll continue our conversation this evening, of course, if there is more information, I will update you. Obviously, if you have friends and relatives in Israel, this is a good time maybe to check that everyone is okay. And I will try. This will be a bit difficult, but I will try at the same time that I'm speaking and also taking questions to once in a while peek at my phone and see new information and try to share it with you as it comes in, because again, it's still an ongoing event. We're not sure it's over yet. We're not sure the terrorists who are responsible for this are either dead or arrested. There is some kind of a manhunt right now going on in the small streets around Dizengoff. The police is really, from what I understand, moving from house to house on the scene, searching. I don't know if for a shooter or perhaps for someone who assisted the shooter, but really a painful situation. It's been almost a year since the May 2021 Israel-Hamas war, which I think was the last time we really had this kind of ongoing security crisis. Back then, the characteristics were a bit different. There was, of course, massive rocket launching from Gaza into Israel. Some of it actually bypassing the Iron Dome and landing in Israeli cities. And then we also had a lot of violence in the streets, kind of mob violence, violence between citizens, attacks on people who were driving home or were coming back from work. I can share with you that this was the events of last year. They were even very personal for my family because my wife's uncle was killed in those events. His name was Yigal Yoshua. He lived in the city of Lod, which is a mixed Arab-Jewish city. During the first days of the war, when we were still not really fully understanding of what was happening, was driving home from work, and a group of young Arab men from a nearby neighborhood threw stones at his car and killed him. And my biggest fear right now, apart of course from the fact that what is happening is by itself already tragic, is that we will return somehow to the event of last year, that we will once again see uncontrolled violence in the streets. I really, really hope it does not deteriorate to that low level again. But the situation is difficult. We also know that 2 of the 3 previous attacks were committed by Arab citizens of Israel. I'm talking here about the attack in Be'er Sheva, which was carried out by an ISIS supporting terrorist from Hura. It's a Bedouin town in the Negev outside Be'er Sheva. And then the attack in Hadera, which was carried out by 2 cousins from al-Fahem, an Arab Israeli city. And this by itself presents another level of complication, of difficulty, because when we talk about attacks like the one that took place in Bnei Brak later, which was carried out by a Palestinian from the West Bank, the tool, the arsenal of tools that Israel has in such a situation is one that we are more accustomed to use. Okay, there is a village or a neighborhood that this terrorist came from, you go and you make arrests of people who may have been involved, and you investigate potential links, and you can put some travel restrictions on the ground. You try to understand where the intelligence went wrong, and there are other tools at the military and Shin Bet, like the Israeli internal security's disposal. When we are talking about citizens of the state of Israel committing such attacks, and I don't know yet that this is the case in Tel Aviv. We don't know who committed the attack in Tel Aviv yet. Maybe that information will come in as we speak. But in 2 of the previous cases, we know that the terrorists were citizens of Israel, and that is more difficult to handle. It's also, I have to say, a rather new phenomenon. We've had in the past, I just give an example from last year, violent events and terror events involving citizens of Israel. But the fact that 2 such events happened within 1 week, and both of them basically involved terrorists inspired by ISIS, is a new situation, very worrying situation that I'm not sure the authorities in Israel, police, Shin Bet, military, have yet discovered a way to handle. This requires a different toolbox, a different mode of operation than a regular military situation in the West Bank. So we'll have to wait and see. And of course, it's also difficult because the vast majority of Arab citizens of Israel, at the end of the day, are law-abiding citizens in this country who want to live their lives, raise their families, work. And the fact that you have several events like of this kind, it creates a very bad and dangerous atmosphere between Jewish and Arab citizens in the state of Israel. It poisons the relationship. It hurts any prospect for cooperation, which is in fact what we need. This cooperation, at the end of the day, the Arab citizens of Israel are 20% of this country. They are very important for the functioning of vast sectors in the economy, including, by the way, the health system. If you ever travel to Israel and you need to get to a hospital, I don't, I don't wish for that to happen. But if, God forbid, during a trip to Israel, you will need to go to a hospital, you will see the very, very prominent presence of Arab Israeli staff in the hospitals, in everywhere in the health system, doctors, nurses, social workers, pharmacists. And this is just one example. So integration of the Arab minority in Israel is very important for the prosperity, for the success of the country. And events like this, like the one in Hadera and Beersheba, and we will wait to see the background of the shooter in Tel Aviv. But events of that kind turn us back. One event that actually moved us forward in the last year was the foundation of the current Israeli government, what was called at the time of its creation the change government in Israel. I think some people who are on this call understand Israeli politics very well and can actually explain it to me, and maybe others are less informed. So I will try very briefly just to put everyone on the same page. If you know this, I apologize. I promise I'll try to make it quick. This government led by Naftali Bennett was formed in June of 2021 after Israel, during a period of 2 years, had 4 consecutive elections. By itself, an unprecedented crisis in Israeli democracy. We've never had something like this before. 4 elections in 2 years. Even if you're the only democracy in the Middle East, which is something that we in Israel are proud of, it's not a healthy thing to go through. And I think it really tested the nerves of the Israeli public. An election in our time and age always comes with amounts of poisonous propaganda and hate and division. And that's not really what the state of Israel needs right now. And so after another round of elections that ended inconclusively, 8 different parties from across the political spectrum. There was the Yamina party of Naftali Bennett. Literally, the name means further to the right, Yamina, obviously a right-wing conservative party, all the way to Meretz on the left, and also an Arab Islamist party, what we call the United Arab List, not to be confused with the Joint List, which is a more secular-leaning, very left-wing, kind of communist Arab party that is actually in the opposition right now. But the United Arab List, which is the more conservative one, also joined this coalition. And together, these 8 parties running all the way from Bennett's on the right-wing end of it to Meretz and the United Arab List on the left-wing end of it, decided to join forces with really 2 goals. Goal number 1, avoid another election, because if they had not formed a government, we would have gone to another round of election and maybe another one afterward, because if 4 times did not solve the riddle, why would number 5 and number 6 do the job? And the second purpose was to end the rule of Benjamin Netanyahu, who had been the prime minister for 12 consecutive years, and was already, by the time this happened last year, facing criminal indictments in 3 corruption cases. His trial had already begun. And these parties agreed that a prime minister under a criminal trial is not a good idea. He needs to focus on handling the affairs of the state of Israel, which, as you can see, even on this evening, are some of the most complicated in the world, I dare say. Here in Israel, just if you look at the past week, We've had a major political crisis. I will get to it in a minute. But at the same time, we are experiencing this major political crisis. We are also in the midst of an ongoing security crisis with the fourth terror attack, with deadly terror attack in 2 weeks. And we are still, like other countries, getting over the COVID pandemic and the economic damages that it brought with it. So it's a very complicated role, and these parties agreed that it should not be Netanyahu who was indicted and was going to trial. They formed this very eclectic, very diverse ideologically, in many ways unprecedented coalition. And the involvement of an Arab party in that coalition was seen as a milestone. It's a very important moment in the history of the Arab-Israeli minority in Israel, as a sign that Arab Israelis were moving towards integration and partnership in Israel and being really part of a government, even though de facto there are the United Arab List does not have government ministers. It's part of the coalition, and we do have Arab Israeli ministers even in this government from Meretz, and so that was seen as a big step forward. Now we are seeing two events that are again happening at the same time that threaten this progress. Of course, one of them is the terror wave that we are experiencing, and we know, again, two of the attacks committed by Arab Israeli citizens. We don't know yet the full background of the event in Tel Aviv. And then we are also seeing a political crisis that started before tonight's terror attack, of course, that is threatening the stability of the government. And this part of the conversation will be a bit complicated. I'll try to explain what exactly is happening. When the government was formed, it enjoyed the smallest possible majority in the Israeli Knesset. Overall, in the Knesset, there are 120 members. This government was sworn in with the support of 61. 61 out of 120 is the bare minimum. It's not the first time in Israeli history we've had a 61 member coalition. We've had it before. Even I think Netanyahu's 2015 government had only 61 members originally. Later he expanded it. But that creates a very, very precarious situation where basically each and every member of the governing coalition is finger number 61. Each and every member of the governing coalition, if they decide not to vote with the government anymore, can bring everything to a halt. Because once that one member decides to abstain or oppose government legislation, the government does not have a majority. And the very fact that this government was formed with 8 parties and the 61 there, a minimum majority is kind of a political miracle, if you will. And it actually succeeded to do some very surprising things. One of them was passing a state budget in the month of December, which was very, very important because a state budget gives the government some level of stability. Israel did not have a state budget for 3 consecutive years under Netanyahu in his, the final 3 years of his previous term. There were many reasons why the state budget wasn't passed, but really Netanyahu himself didn't want it. There was a situation in which the political instability and uncertainty served him in his fight with the legal system in Israel. And this new government, despite having the bare minimum majority, succeeded in passing a state budget that is actually, that state budget is relevant for 2 years since the date was passed. So that's very important by itself. As Ron mentioned earlier, I'm joining you from Kibbutz Nahal Oz, where I live. It's on the Israeli border with Gaza. This is the picture in my background. I use it sometimes for Zoom calls at night when it's dark. There is no good natural light. And Nahal Oz, a very beautiful place, and sitting basically less than a mile from Gaza, from the border. This area of Israel suffered directly from the lack of a state budget in those 3 years. I can tell you that when my wife and I went to the US, when I was appointed the Washington correspondent for Haaretz, that was in late 2016 after Donald Trump won that American election, there were several infrastructure projects in our area that were just beginning to happen. And when we came back in 2020, at the end of 2020, after your previous election, those projects were stuck in place because there was no state budget to invest in them. Now, this is just one local example from my area of Israel, but this was happening all over the country. So passing a state budget was a very important achievement, not just politically. It actually had real life implications for citizens of Israel in really all over the country. But this government, the ideological divisions were present all the time, even when it succeeded to be born in the first place, to pass a budget, to pass economic reforms and religious reforms that were very important for the state of Israel. The tensions were always there. There were tensions over the Israeli-Palestinian issue. You have here a party that wants to expand settlements, that supports annexation, the Bennett's party. You have Meretz, which is, I think, really the last true believers in a two-state solution. It's a viable option right now in Israel. Many Israelis think the two-state solution is a good idea, but don't think it can be implemented. I would actually argue that's the majority of the country at this point in time. So very, very diverse views. And we were seeing tensions over issues like building in settlements, dialogue with the Palestinians already emerge. In recent weeks, what has actually taken over the headlines, and I think is a bit ridiculous, but who am I to determine, is the issue of chametz in Israeli hospitals during Pesach. I spoke earlier about if one of you in the audience will ever have to be at an Israeli hospital, you will see the diversity of the staff. I really hope, though, for you, that unless you keep kosher in Pesach, you will not be hospitalized during Pesach. Because for many years in Israel, there were directives by the health ministry, which was controlled by the ultra-Orthodox parties, that basically said people who are hospitalized cannot bring chametz into their room in the hospital during Pesach. Now, I want to say something about this from the perspective of a secular Israeli Jew who does not keep kosher for Pesach. I am a big believer in respecting one another as the only way to manage to live a common life in a complicated country like Israel. So when I say that I don't keep kosher, that means that in my house, for example, I will eat whatever I want on Passover. But my next door neighbors here in the kibbutz, they do keep kosher. I will not sit outside on the lawn in front of their house and eat pita with hummus while they are in the week of not eating bread. That's not something I will do. And when it comes to the hospitals, the Supreme Court of Israel, after many years and appeals over this issue, basically said the hospitals cannot sanction the people from eating chametz in their beds, in their rooms in the hospital, but there should not be chametz in the public areas of the hospital. People, who are fasting during this period, I mean, not completely fasting, but not eating bread, should not be challenged like this with others, eating in front of their face. But if you want to eat it in your own bed, in your own room, in your little private space that you have when you are hospitalized, it's unreasonable to make that forbidden. I thought personally that was a good decision, a reasonable one, and it was actually first implemented last year at the last weeks of the Netanyahu government. Now, however, under this government, the health minister is Nitzan Horowitz from Meretz, and he issued a letter last week to the directors of Israel's hospitals, reminding them that they have to respect the Supreme Court decision from last year and allow people to eat chametz in their rooms in the hospital. One member of Naftali Bennett's Yamina party, Idit Silman, she was the majority whip in the coalition, not a junior position, let's call it. I mean, she's a relatively young and inexperienced member of Knesset, but she had an important role. She made a big fuss out of this. She said that Horowitz's letter is an attack on the Jewish values of Israel and a personal attack on the other members of the coalition, the more conservative members like her. And then on Wednesday morning, yesterday, she really submitted a political bombshell and announced that because of this issue, she was leaving the coalition. She will no longer vote with the coalition, and she is basically joining the opposition and plans in the next election, which we don't know yet when it will happen, I'll get to it in a second, to run under Likud. Of course, this is a very dramatic situation because, first of all, it means the government no longer has a majority, right? I said earlier, in a 61 member coalition, any member can be 61, can be the deciding vote. She decided that she no longer wants to be there. And now they only have 60. The government lacks a majority. Now, some caveats about what this actually means. First of all, it does not mean that the government is collapsing, because according to the, because first of all, there is a draw in the Knesset right now. It's a tied game. There are 60 opposition members and 60 coalition members. So they don't have a majority to pass legislation, but the opposition also does not have a majority either. Second of all, it's important to remember that in the opposition, out of the 60 current fingers, 6 belong to the joint list, the far left, semi-communist party that is in opposition but is not aligned with Netanyahu and the religious and the ultra-Orthodox parties that are also in the opposition. You have very, very different. The opposition right now is as diverse and eclectic in a sense as the coalition, but it is not cooperating, at least not to the place of initiating an alternative government. So the chance that this development will lead to the return of Netanyahu to the Prime Minister's office in the current makeup of the Knesset, I would say is very low. Because at the end of the day, Netanyahu does not have a majority in this Knesset. That's the reason the government without him was formed in the first place. And of course, the joint list is not going to support Netanyahu. I think there are really two more likely scenarios that could develop out of this, and this is also where the attack in Tel Aviv tonight and the other tragic events of the last 2 weeks come into play. One scenario is that we go to new elections. Basically, the opposition right now has 60. If one more member of Knesset decides to defect from Bennett's party and leave the coalition, the opposition will have a majority in the Knesset. It will have 61 fingers. Those 61 fingers will not be enough to form a different government because, again, the joint list will not support all the right-wing elements, but it could be enough to dissolve the Knesset and go to new election. It's an open question. Will the joint list support dissolving the Knesset and bring down the government, knowing that a new election could potentially bring the return of Netanyahu to power? I'm not sure if they will do it, but I cannot rule it out. And so that's one option, that we have basically the Knesset being dissolved. It will not happen tomorrow morning because the Knesset is not in session until the middle of May. For the next month, the Knesset is out of session. There is Pesach, then there is Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut. The Knesset comes back to session in the middle of May. And then, theoretically, you could have a vote to dissolve it and initiate a new election that will probably take place in October, after the holidays of Rosh Hashanah and the high holidays, as they are called in the US. This is one scenario. The second scenario is that the government beat up, no longer with a majority, facing a very difficult security crisis, still manages somehow to soldier on. It will be very hard. What it will require, first of all, it will require that there will not be more defections from Bennett's party. So I think more defections will increase the likelihood of dissolving and going to election. It will not verify it, but it will increase the likelihood. If the Bennett's party stays together after Silman left and there are 60 for the coalition and 60 for the opposition, what the government will have to do is that for every crucial vote, they will have to look for specific supporters in the opposition. They can find them either in the joint list or in the ultra-Orthodox parties. That's where you can have more freelance players. I don't think anyone in Likud or in the very far right, the Bezalel Smotrich party, will help the government on anything. But maybe one or two members of the joint list or one or two ultra-Orthodox members, in return for some specific commitment from the government, budgetary or legislative, will agree to donate their fingers to pass legislation. I think those are the likelier scenarios we're talking about right now. There are also some wildcard scenarios. For example, a new government gets formed, but it's not led by either Bennett or Netanyahu. It's led by some kind of a more consensus candidate. One name that has been mentioned a lot in the political speculation is Benny Gantz, the defense minister, the former chief of staff. Benny Gantz has an open door with the ultra-Orthodox parties. He can perhaps even win some support from the Arab parties. He's not being ruled out by people who rule out Netanyahu. He's not being ruled out by people who rule out Bennett. I think, again, I would not call that a likely scenario, although I will say the deterioration of the security situation with these terrible attacks coming one after the other might also create some kind of a discussion about the advantages of having a retired general, leader of the IDF, right now navigating the ship. But that's still pretty far. I don't see it happening immediately. And again, it will require the Knesset to be in session and vote for a new government anyway. Right now, I think what we're looking at is Bennett in a very miserable situation, honestly, politically, but also with what is happening in the country. Trying to soldier on. First of all, he needs to stop the terror attacks, and that's very difficult because these seem to be lone wolf attacks. These don't seem to be very highly organized or organizational attacks. They seem to be initiatives of one or two terrorists who perhaps don't communicate by cell phone when they discuss this, but they meet in person. They decide they want to go and do a terror attack. They have access to weapons because, unfortunately, the Arab society in Israel is flooded with illegal weapons. Many of them were stolen over the years from the military. This is a major, major problem of Israel, even beyond the aspect of terrorism, because these weapons are responsible for violent crime within the Arab society that has led to hundreds of deaths of Israeli citizens in recent years. And the government has been taking a strong initiative to try to collect those weapons and to arrest people who are involved in all kinds of criminal activity. But that easy access to weapons, combined with propaganda and incitement on the internet, creates the lone wolf phenomenon, which is very, very difficult to stop. Not impossible, but very difficult. And then on top of that, Bennett also needs to make sure that no one else defects from his party, because more defections, I think, will increase the likelihood of at some point a vote to dissolve the Knesset. And of course, this is where the two problems also collide for him, because the security situation, the failure of the government to get a grip on these terror attacks, I think increases the pressure on the members of his party to defect and pave the way for another election. There is a reasonable argument to make that why is an election a good solution to this? How does an election now help us deal with this crisis? But if there is a sense that the government is losing control over a situation, at some point people will say, well, you know what, let someone else try to deal with it. And then the last thing I will say, what will the result of the election be? Of course, I cannot predict. I don't think they will be very different than the 4 previous rounds. And then, we could find ourselves again on the hamster wheel of non-stop Israeli elections. I will stop here and start taking some questions from the Q&A. Ron, you want to present the questions, or should I?
Yeah, I'm going to present them to you. Yeah.
Okay.
So Amir, thank you very much for that very comprehensive analysis. And we've got a bunch of questions. What I try to do is I'm going to try to combine them. So because some of the people are asking similar questions. So one person's, we have a combination of 2 questions. What is the status of Bibi's criminal case at this moment?
Of his what?
What is the status of Bibi's criminal case at this moment?
The Netanyahu trial has been continuing all along, kind of in the background to all the other dramas in the country. And actually, there are also dramas in the courtroom, because in the last 2 weeks, there was a testimony by Shlomo Halber, who used to be the director of the Ministry of Communications under Netanyahu and one of the closest people to him. And he became a state witness against Netanyahu. He gave his testimony, which I think I'm not a legal expert. I can only quote what I've read from people that I trust more than myself on this issue. Seems to have put the prime minister in a more difficult spot legally. In general, I think we are seeing 2 clocks ticking in the background right now. There is the political clock and the legal clock. The legal clock for Netanyahu is that the trial is going on. We've already heard, I think, more than 10 witnesses at this point. Other key witnesses are about to take the stand, and his situation does not look very good. There was one negotiation over a plea deal, fell apart. I will not be surprised if we see another one starting soon. But then there is the political clock, and it's also ticking. The political clock seems to be more in a pace that is better for Netanyahu. Because if this government is in a crisis after crisis, losing the majority in the Knesset, losing the ability to control the security situation in the streets, if a month from today we're going to or not a month, but a month and a half, new elections are called, theoretically Netanyahu can win that election. What does win mean for Netanyahu? For Netanyahu, winning the election, it doesn't mean that Likud will be the biggest party. Likud was the biggest party in all the election rounds of the last 2.5 years. Winning the election means for Netanyahu securing a majority of 61 members of Knesset who will support legislation to cancel his criminal indictment. And on top of that, legislation to forbid the Supreme Court from intervening in the issue. Because, right, if Netanyahu gets to a place where he has a majority that passes a law that cancels his own trial, it's almost a given that the Israeli Supreme Court will intervene and say this is illegal. And so you will need on top of it legislation that gives the government the power to overrule Supreme Court decisions. This is something that Netanyahu 10 years ago opposed vehemently. I mean, this was already discussed in right-wing religious circles in Israel 10 years ago because of Supreme Court decisions of religion and state that the religious parties did not like. And Netanyahu said one of the important foundations of Israel, as the only democracy in the Middle East, is the independence of the judicial legal system. Today, he sees it a bit differently because of his own predicament. So that's what winning would mean for him. And if there is no election, he gets to a point where he has that kind of majority, perhaps he can stop the legal clock from ticking. But both of them are moving right now, legal and political.
Another question, is there a possibility that someone other than Bibi would end up being the candidate for Likud?
Extremely unlikely. Only if Netanyahu decides himself to take a plea deal and leave political life. Inside Likud, his popularity is as high as it's ever been. The party is united behind him. Actually, Likud has become more Bibisty, as we call it in Israel, like Trumpist in America, okay? Likud has come even more Bibisty in the last year than before because many of the more moderate Likud members left. Some of them resigned, they left political life. Some of them joined other parties and are now members of the ruling coalition. So Likud is even more under Netanyahu's grip than it was 3 years ago.
This other question says, this person wrote that Idit Silman's purported explanation for quitting the coalition has so little substance. What do you think actually laid behind her decision? Did Likud just offer her what she saw as a better deal?
I cannot get inside her head. I know that she was facing pressures from her own family, including her husband, who is a supporter of Netanyahu and does not support Bennett, to do this. She was threatened and her children were harassed in their own community for her membership in the government. And maybe at some point she just gave in. Maybe she was convinced by Likud that they will give her although the Israeli political history is rich with people who have unfulfilled promises from Netanyahu. I mean, really, there's a long list of politicians who were promised that he would give them this ministry or that ministry if they only support him before or after the election and never got what they wanted. So I'm not sure what led to her. What I do believe is that it was not really about Hametz in the hospitals. Hametz in the hospital is a solvable issue. It's one of those issues that actually it's very rare that you will really see Israelis fighting over it inside the hospital itself, because most people in Israel at the end of the day know how to get along. And if there is a religious patient next to a secular patient, they will discuss this and find a compromise that both of them can live with. Most people in Israel in the private environment don't want to force their way of life on the other. It's the politicians that fight over this, and even in this case, I think that the political fight is a bit made up.
So the next question is, if there were new elections held, do you see any surprises among existing parties? Some parties doing much better than they did this time or in the last election, others decreasing in seats.
Ron, if there is a new election, if it will be in October, October is half a year from now. Half a year in Israeli politics is like a decade in other countries' politics. I'm not going to predict what will happen a decade from today anywhere in the world. So maybe we'll do another session before the election, like 2 months before the election. I'm willing to try to answer this question. Okay, but not now.
So, what is the likelihood that somebody of the in the opposition, or I guess in Likud's, I guess in opposition, still in opposition technically, will jump to their rescue? I know you said something about a deal. Can you pick 2 or 3 people who might
Who
you
you
think
mean would join the coalition?
and save Naftali Bennett's premiership?
I don't see anyone from Likud doing it. I think maybe Bennett on occasional votes can have support of either 2 or 3 ultra-Orthodox members or 2 or 3 Arab members. I have to say something about, again, the impact of the terror attacks. If Bennett was now a strong and popular prime minister who is getting good results in the public opinion poll and seems to have the situation in the country under control, maybe there would be a temptation for members of Likud to defect into his, join the strong horse, okay? Join the winning team. When Bennett is seen as kind of a lame duck who is struggling with these terrible terror attacks, that does not encourage people to join. It actually, I think, increases the likelihood that maybe more people will defect from him.
Has his that? Go ahead. I have another question, but it's related
If
to
he
that.
gets this under control a few weeks from now, he gets both the security crisis and the political crisis under control. The Knesset is back in session. Maybe. But in the current situation, he does not look strong enough, I think, to be able to tempt people to defect from Likud.
I'm wondering if his sort of outsized role. I mean, Israel being attempting to be a mediator between Russia and Ukraine, and I think he's the only Western leader that's met with Putin. I'm wondering if that's had any impact on Israeli public opinion of him as a world player, as increased his gravitas. I mean, in any way that might help save his coalition.
No, not at all. I think, Ron, this is a really interesting question. The Abraham Accords did not save Benjamin Netanyahu. Think what an amazing achievement the Abraham Accords were. Okay, I'm not a big fan of Netanyahu, as you might have guessed from my presentation. I still think the Abraham Accords were an amazing achievement that I give him a ton of credit for.
Right.
But the Abraham Accords were signed in September 2020. In the election that took place 5 months later, Netanyahu did not win a majority, and that was the election that finally ended his hold on power. If the Abraham Accords did not help Netanyahu, I'm sure that Bennett's negotiation with Putin and Zelensky is not going to help Bennett. These are not the issues that Israelis vote on right now. Maybe in the future, the situation will change. The main issues that Israelis vote on right now, I would divide them into 3 categories. Number 1 is security, of course. If there's a bad security situation, Netanyahu suffered when his government struggled to handle Hamas and attacks from Gaza. Bennett is struggling now when his government is failing on this issue of terror attacks inside the country. That's one issue. Second issue is religious and identity issues. These matter a lot to Israeli voters, not alien to you, of course, in the US as well. Issues around religious identity, the balance between democratic and Jewish in Israel as a country, major issue. And the third, I think, is economic issues. I think Netanyahu lost support over the COVID lockdowns that he initiated that really hurt the economy. And we saw Bennett rising in the polls when his government handled 2 COVID waves without a single day of lockdown. Basically, a lot of investment in vaccines, a lot of promotion of vaccination, no lockdowns. The economic activity continued, and Israel actually had a very successful economic year. That gave Bennett much more public credit than his Saturday night trip to Moscow and the meeting with Putin. I think Bennett actually regrets doing that. I think what he should have been doing in those days was negotiating between Idit Silman and himself, really. I mean, maintaining the pulse, of his members of the party instead of traveling to Moscow and playing Kissinger.
The American axiom, all politics is local, seems to seems to
Indeed.
place in there. And we have a question. Do you see any possibility in the future of a return to a center or a center left government in Israel's political future, and what factors could facilitate that?
We were not far from doing it in two of the election rounds of the crazy years. I'm talking about 2019, 2020. 2019 September, there was an election where the anti-Netanyahu bloc of parties, led by at the time by Benny Gantz, together with the Arabs, had 65 seats in the Knesset. Unfortunately, there was a major moment of political cowardice back then by Gantz himself and members of his party, who decided that they would rather go to another round of elections than form a government that is based on the support of the Arab parties. This was a major mistake, in my opinion. It actually, one of its implications was that it brought down the level of participation of Arab citizens in subsequent elections. People said, if our parties don't get invited, what's the point of voting? And in Israel, when the Arab voting percentage goes down, the conservative, right-wing religious bloc goes up. It's just math. Most Israeli Jews don't change their minds between elections. Most Israeli Jews vote pretty much the same between these election rounds. Really, the big differences are about the voting percentage in the Arab society. So that kind of result it happened 2 years ago. There's no reason why it would not happen again in our lifetime, I mean, in the near future. The question really is the political courage to then take the result and use it to form a government. That's what it would take. The center left in Israel will not be able to govern without the Arabs. That's a very important thing to understand.
Right.
Just like the right wing in Israel, by the way, will never be able to form a government without the ultra-Orthodox. If you take the ultra-Orthodox away from Netanyahu, he does not have a majority ever. He does not have a majority now either, but without the ultra-Orthodox, he's not even close to it. If you take the Arabs away from the center-left, they also don't have a majority. The day the Israeli center-left will understand this, they will have a chance to get back to power.
Because of the ongoing political turmoil in Israel, I know in the past they've gone ahead and they've talked about raising the threshold for participation in the Knesset. Somehow, do you see any movement underway to possibly raise the threshold in the Knesset to lower the number of seats, to reduce the number of parties that would be available, so that it would help end some of this gridlock and bring about a stable government?
Yes, I will answer in a second, Ron. First, I want to say a little update on what's happening in Tel Aviv. We're still talking about 2 people who died and 4 others who are critically wounded. And we're still talking about an ongoing manhunt after the terrorists. Police don't have him in custody yet. This is a very, very difficult situation. Not over yet. And the police is asking people to shut their doors and stay in their houses, not go out to the street until they can give confirmation that they have apprehended this shooter. This is a major situation. I mean, I don't remember a terror attack with this kind of development in many years. The terrorists run loose on the streets. So now to your question on the threshold. I am a huge supporter of raising the electoral threshold in Israel. I think it's one of the most important things that can be done to create political stability and to lower the power of small sectorial parties, which is too high in our politics. The way to do it, there's only one way to achieve it. The way to achieve it is that a government will be comprised of 2 large parties that don't need the small parties for support. For example, Likud and the biggest party and the center left. And they together will initiate a law to raise the electoral threshold, so you have less parties in the Knesset, and the larger parties have more power.
Does that benefit the right or the left more, that threshold?
It doesn't benefit the right or the left. It benefits the state of Israel, because it creates a situation where in elections, people basically need to choose between, well, it depends how high you take it, but instead of going to the voting booth to choose between 15 parties, you go and you have to choose between 5. I think that's a more healthy and normal situation for democracy. Well, if you raise it very high, people will have to choose between two parties. I'm not sure that's what we want. Your experiment with the two-party system doesn't look like a glaring example these days either. But maybe 4 or 5 parties would be better for Israel than 15. But again, to do it, you need to have to start with a government that decides to do it. A government of large parties, the biggest party on the right, the biggest party on the center left. As long as Netanyahu is on the scene and his, personality is so divisive, so controversial among the Israeli public, I don't see that happening because Netanyahu, to stay in power, needs the small parties, the ultra-Orthodox and the far right, and his opponents, to keep him away from power, also need small parties. Look at all the members of this coalition, Meretz and United Arab List, and even Bennett's party. These are small parties. Only when you will have Likud governing together with the biggest party on the center left, whether it's Labor or Yesh Atid, only then you can try to pass this extremely needed reform.
You didn't mention, what do you think about Yair Lapid's future?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. If the government falls apart because the Knesset is dissolved a month and a half from now, Yair Lapid automatically becomes the interim prime minister for the duration of the election. Now, Ron, as you might remember, in Israel, interim prime minister sometimes can be a job for 2 years, right? I think Netanyahu's, last years in office, it was basically election after election. No government is formed, and he remains the caretaker prime minister because nobody else replaces him.
Not a bad job.
Not a bad job. So Lapid would I think Lapid is not afraid of dissolving the Knesset as much as some of the other partners of the government. He would reach election day as the prime minister. Sometimes that gives you a boost, especially if you manage to pretty much keep the country, functioning and sane and not have crazy things like we have tonight in the streets of Tel Aviv. And then if the election finish, if the election results are similar to previous elections and no new government is formed, he remains in office, through another round of election maybe. So for him, this whole development is not as terrible as it is for Bennett, which of course catastrophic. I mean, he could lose everything and it will be the end of his career and he will be remembered as the shortest serving prime minister in the history of Israel. I'm not saying we are there yet. He has a month and a half, not a month and a half, just over a month until the Knesset is back in session to try to calm down the situation, security-wise and politically. But for him, there is much more to lose here than for Lapid.
Just a couple quick questions. Do you think the Nationality Act led to the radicalization of Israeli Arabs?
No, the Nationality Act, I was against it. I thought it was, I'll just use the word in Hebrew, meyutar, okay, unnecessary. It was like, just taunting. In my opinion, I don't think it can be credited with these events. These events have to do more with radicalization of people who spend a lot of time on the internet and get exposed to propaganda over there, ISIS-inspired material, and these videos. It's a big dilemma on behalf, on our part of the media. The videos from terror scenes, it's the public right to know, right? People have a right to see the picture. But when you show them, sometimes you create a copycat situation. These people who are already on the edge, this gives them the inspiration to go and carry out an attack of their own. And my problem with the nationality law is not the radicalization, is that it's an insult to the Arab police officer who served in the Israeli police and protects lives. And to the Arab
and one who died recently.
Yeah, I don't want to speak in his name. I'm talking about,
in general.
The Arab doctor who may be treating wounded people from the terror attack in Tel Aviv tonight. That's my problem with it. I will not tie it to the security events because I think that's a different function.
In addition to the comment section, you're getting a lot of people complimenting you and saying what a great talk you gave. I'm going to try and give you 2 last questions. As a friend, I'm going to ask you to steal 5 more minutes. Will the Iran nuclear deal coming up have any impact on the Israeli if Israel goes to elections?
I don't think so. On Iran, there is really a wide consensus in most of the Israeli political system that is against an Iran deal, but also doesn't really have an alternative. It's a weird Israeli position for many years. It started under Netanyahu, and Bennett is continuing it. And some of the parties that opposed Netanyahu when he was prime minister also shared it at the same time, like Yair Lapid. Basically, they were against Obama's Iran deal. They will be against Biden's Iran deal. And when they get asked, okay, what should be instead? They say you should get a better deal. Now, is it possible to get a better deal? I don't know. I mean, maybe it is. You put sanctions and pressure and you threaten military action. But when you have an international negotiation with so many partners, the US and Germany and Britain and France and Russia and China and Iran, you know, it's a difficult one to manage. I'm not sure that if we gave the Israeli negotiators the lead on this one, they would get a very, very different agreement. But I don't think politically it will have much of an influence because this kind of weird position of we were against this deal, we want you to get a better one, but at the same time, you know, how do you do it? It's quite common. It was Netanyahu's policy, it's Bennett's policy. I don't think this issue will impact this. And also the Iran issue, Israelis are, I'm going to say something that will sound weird to you. I think most Israelis are not afraid of the Iran nuclear issue on the day-to-day. It's like a far away kind of thing, okay? I mean, if Iran gets to a nuclear bomb and decides to use it, it's the end of our lives. But the same can be said about Putin throwing a nuclear missile on Washington, D.C. tomorrow. I don't think people are walking the streets of Washington, even right now with the tensions in Ukraine, afraid that a nuclear missile will fall from the sky. People in Israel, what they are afraid of is terror attacks, like we saw tonight. This is the security issue that is really threatening any Israeli government's ability to remain in power. Iran is more, you know, strategic, theoretical, long-term kind of issue.
Final question. Next, any surprises or anything we should be looking for in the next few weeks to give us a signal before the Knesset convenes? Anything we should be looking at to see politically, to see how things may end up in the future?
The most important question for Bennett is, will the terror wave be stopped? Once he stops the terror wave, I think it will give him breathing room in the weeks until the Knesset is back. I think it's 5 or 6 weeks to sit quietly with the members of his party, secure their commitment to him, and try maybe even to convince Miss Silman to retract her letter of, you know, it's not a resignation. It's like, you know, I don't know, defection. Basically tell her, look, there's not going to be another election. The government will stay in place. You will be the only loser from this. But he can only do it if he manages, first of all, to stop the chaos in the streets, and then secure that there are no more defections from his own party. If he does that, I will not be surprised if eventually, at the end of the day, when the Knesset is back in the Silman is back with the coalition. We've seen weirder things in Israeli politics. But if the situation deteriorates, I will also not be surprised if we see another defector or two from his party, and then it's anyone's bet what happens next.
Amir, thank you for a wonderful, comprehensive, and fascinating discussion. We hope that you'll maybe be in the Washington area soon. If you come over, we'd love to host you. In the meantime, it looks like you, whether it's staring here from Rockville or whether from our favorite Silver Diner spot in Rockville, Amir, or whether we're sitting
Good memories from that
in State Road, yeah, or whether we're sitting anywhere in Israel, we're going to have to just wait to see as things unfold, and we may have to have you back again to go ahead and to give us future analysis. And we'd love to have you back actually to do that. So for that, everybody, first everyone in our audience, thank you so much for joining us. Amir, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Adam Odessa, our director of our Stewart Lessons Israel Action Center, thank you so much.
And Ron, the last word I want to say, really, let's all pray for peace this weekend, for quiet, for you know, healing to the wounded from this attack, and comfort to the families, and that with God's help, inshallah, Bezrat Hashem, this terrible thing will stop.
Bezrat Hashem, Amen.
Thank you. Good night from here.
Thank you, everybody. We look forward to seeing you on our next webinar.